Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
Hello and welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is your host and founder at Greenlight Guru, John Speer. Joining me, this has become a familiar face, as co-host Etienne Nichols. Etienne, welcome back.
Thanks, John. Good to be back.
All right. I dig your studio setup. I got to figure out how to mimic that some way.
$100 and I'll get you there.
But the books, those aren't virtual books. Those are real books.
That was my own design too. I'll have to tell you about the design of that sometime.
We're going to talk about contract manufacturing here in a moment, so maybe we can lace that into the conversation. But also joining us is a repeat guest, Mark Rutkiewicz with Innovize and Consiliso. Mark, welcome back.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. Etienne, nice to see you again.
To be back.
Well, today, Etienne, what are we talking about?
So we're talking about how to select a contract manufacturer. So
this is a good one.
Lots of ways. Yeah, I'm excited about this one because this is something that, I've dealt with this some, but I know there are lots of aspects of this that I'm excited to learn about. So,
well, and, a lot of our listeners I know are startups or smaller companies. Probably say I've been in the industry for about 23 years. I remember it was probably a good 15 or so years ago. There was a trend. The huge trend at that time was outsource everything for medical device companies. In fact, there was a huge outsourcing to places in China and that sort of thing because it's cheaper, faster, whatever. I think that pendulum's come back. There's still some outsourcing to China, but there's still a theme of outsourcing, and especially for a startup company. I mean, they're probably not going to build a brick and mortar. Mark, you are a contract manufacturer. I know you have some specialization with your contract manufacturing, but you've been in the industry quite a bit longer than I have. I'm sure you've seen all these trends. What are your latest, greatest? What's happening in the world of contract manufacturing?
Yeah, it's about 20 years ago. I really started seeing. I remember talking to a company about 20 years ago. It's like, how many people in your company? 4. It's like 4 people. It's like, yeah, he's the head of design and he's working with a contract design house. I'm head of quality and this person's the head of operations and supply chain. And so they're dealing with a contract manufacturer that's building the product.
Right.
So 4 people basically run the company and everything's outsourced. So it's like, what? And that's almost the model today because, if you're a startup and you have so much dollars, where are you going to spend your money? I'm not going to spend my money building a manufacturing plant that's going to build 100 parts for the clinical trial and then sit idle for 2 years while the clinical trial gets done.
It just doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense. Yeah. So that's why. So manufacturing is where it started, contract. But now, you look at the FDA registration things, you can register as a contract manufacturer for the design control. You can register as a contract manufacturer for manufacturing. You can register as a contract manufacturer for post-market. So you can outsource your complaint handling. And there's companies that just do that. So you can outsource all these different aspects, and that's all part of contract manufacturing. I'll call it contract manufacturing, but it's contracting aspects of your business, depending on the size you're doing. I mean, accounting too. I mean, you don't necessarily need, if you don't have a lot of dollars going in and out, you don't need a full-time staff for that. But if you have the plant, then the plus here is on contract manufacturers can build out the equipment. And so this is actually interesting. So I started working with contract manufacturers back in the 80s and early 90s. So when I was working at cardiac pacemakers at the time, and we were making our own programmers. We were soldering circuit boards for the programmers for the pacemakers. It's like, we make pacemakers, we don't make programmers. And we had to buy new technology, more equipment, because it's like, let's not do that, let's outsource. So I remember going to like the first, outsourcing our circuit board manufacturing.
Yeah.
And so learning about that, it's like, wow, you have all this new technology because they have to. Circuit board manufacturers, especially in the US, they're really not going to get the volume here. I mean, if you have high volume, that's going to be done outside the US typically because of labor costs. But more and more of it's being automated. So as you automate the machines, and a lot of contract manufacturers do that, they try to save costs and with volume, and then design their machines to be flexible so they can keep them running all the time. So, as a contract manufacturer here, we have a lot of customers that order once a quarter, and we can run it in 2 days. And, that would be totally non-value added for them to have a plant that runs for 2 days and stuff like that. And we've had a lot of customers that, you just do all our manufacturing for us. And then if we don't have business, we just move those people to a different project, different equipment and stuff.
So a question for you, I mean, because clearly we've talked before, I mean, the term medical device is so broad. I mean, it covers such a wide array of materials, technologies, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly not all manufacturing is the same. And so let's imagine that I'm, a startup or maybe even a small company that thought, I could do my manufacturing, but I'm at a point where I need to engage a contract manufacturer. how do I find the options? What should I be looking for? What sort of characteristics should I, or should they be in my backyard? Should I look overseas? What are some of your thoughts about that? Like, how can, we help folks develop sort of a checklist as far as, the evaluation?
Yeah, I actually wrote a white paper on this. That white paper is actually out on MDDI.
Well, wherever it is, send it over to us and we'll include a link to it.
The concept is all those things you want to look at. You typically, most people just look at cost. What's it going to cost? I'll go to the cheapest cost. That'll be great. Well, that's one of the things you should be looking for. But, look at where they're located too. Now today with COVID and stuff, everybody's learning more digital, but still going to the plant and seeing the products and seeing as they're manufacturing, if they're making it right, understanding it is important. So you might not have to go there every day, but you're going to go there regularly. The farther away they get,
I always said I wanted to be in strangling distance of my suppliers.
That's a good thing.
And vice versa, though. I was also in strangling distance with them. So
yeah, the farther away you get the manufacturer, the more you're relying on them to do stuff. No, so it's really simple. They're making tubing and cutting it to a certain length. Okay, that's easy. As they're making the device, as you're doing assembly, things to look at is how complex is your product? How many process validations will be needed? And, you have to know that yourself going in. The contract manufacturer is only going to do what you tell them to do. They're going to quote you all these things. And so that's, as Innovize here, we quote these things and say, hey, some things you need validations for and some things you don't. If it can't be verified by a subsequent inspection or test, it needs to be validated. So typically package seals, bonds and stuff like that, laser welds and stuff like that, all have to be validated. But there's parts that don't have to be validated. If you can see that it's this dimension, you don't have to validate it. But if you do validate it, then you know the capability of the process and you know how good your parts are going to be. Right. So you really want to do more validation than what's really required, depending on how much controls, inspections, and tests you want to throw in. And now if you can say, hey, I want you to do this functional test and it's a computer system and you run the test and the software does it all, great. That's good. But then you got to the upfront work with that. But
let me jump in on that too, because you mentioned cost a moment ago. What you're describing is an element of cost. But if you're not educated, it's going to seem like the contract manufacturer that's going to validate more might be more expensive to get started, but is going to be less expensive after they've gone through that validation because it doesn't require the humans to do the actual inspections, right? So these are somewhat complicated, but you have to think about the upfront cost versus the long-term costs. Right. And validation is a huge benefit.
Right. And by validating, you can get more confidence and you don't have to worry about that down the road. Now, how much money do you have? And then sterilization required. So contract manufacturers, sterilizers are all contract manufacturers. So if you need product sterilized, that has to happen. That's actually very specific. So, there are standards, ISO standards for what the contract manufacturers do for sterilization. And the costs are fairly fixed and you know what that is. But then if you get into injection molding and you get into catheter assembly and those types of things, those you really want to talk to the manufacturer about. Now, when you're working with a contract manufacturer, so cost is one key thing. Location and availability of what services can they provide? Can they do validation? Can they do this? How much can they do? Can they push things out to other ones? So they can't do sterilization, but they can ship it to the sterilizer. Great. Versus, no, we don't do any labeling. We can do the part, but then you have to send somebody else to package and label, and then somebody else sterilizes it. So you have to understand what your supply chain is. When you're working with a contract manufacturer, it's like, well, I want them to make this. Well, how much information are you going to give them? If you want to get a good quote, you have to give them all the information you possibly have. It's like, who are the suppliers you've used? What's the cost you've been? It's like, what's the expectations? Like, well, I want them to figure it out. Yeah, they can, but you're not going to get a good number, or you're going to get somebody that's going to lowball you to get the business. And then you're going to get nickeled and dimed, and it's going to cost you a ton more in the back end. And so it's really the service that they provide and the kind of questions they ask. Do they really know the medical device industry? And if they ask those questions, great. If you're not as experienced, when you go out and look for, and so I did this, I've been on both sides. I'm a manufacturer and trying to find contract manufacturers. Actually, the job right for Innovize, I was in a company, we were moving from Canada to the United States, this company. And so we're looking at some contract manufacturers, and we looked at 10 different contract manufacturers for some catheter assembly and packaging and asked them questions. And it was interesting to see what each of them were asking. And it's like some of them asked things, and it's like, oh, okay. And some of them didn't. It's like, well, how can you quote this? You can quote it, but in the back end.
I've been through that too. Like there's tells, right? When you're in the process of trying to identify potential contract manufacturers, for all intents and purposes, there's an element of it that's like an interview. Essentially, at the end of the day, you're going to be hiring this resource to represent your company in some form or fashion. So you should treat it as an interview. And if some contract manufacturers don't ask or seem interested about attributes or whatever the case may be, I mean, they may not pass that sniff test. So, that should raise your antenna or spidey senses just a little bit.
Right. Oh, yeah. And, it's like, I talked to one company, like, you want this. Why are you doing all of this? It's like, sometimes like you're doing an overkill. It's like, well, depending on the kind of device, it's like I got to do a gauge R&R. It's like, okay, I only need you to make 100 parts. So sometimes with the contract manufacturer, they're going to quote you based on the technology they have. So do they have a technology that, I can make you 100,000 parts every year? Well, I need 100. Well, we don't want to touch you.
Yeah.
Versus this company, I can do 100 parts, but I can't do 100,000. Okay. So do you want somebody that can scale? Yes or no? Or it's like, oh, I'm going to qualify this contract manufacturer for upfront because they're cheaper and I don't need to scale yet. And then when I scale, I'm going to move over here. Well, if you're going to do that, understand what those requirements are. And do you have the information to share there? Because you're going to have to revalidate then, because you're switching manufacturers and you're switching the manufacturing process even. Molds are a key thing here. It's like, there's now companies that, you can 3D print a mold and you get 1,000 hits off it. So you get the plastic part, you get 1,000, but then you got to requalify the mold down the road. And that's great for your clinical trial. But if you want a mold that makes 1 million parts a year, it's going to have to be this really high end, expensive mold with heating elements and all these sensors in it and stuff like that. So it's volume is really key. I mean, that's really the key aspect of the price of the part, and what your volume is going to be is directly related, because there's some fixed costs always. And let your NRE, and it's like,
one thing I was curious about. Well, sorry, go ahead, John.
No, your mic sounds better than mine. Go for it.
No. So I was curious. So you mentioned about some contract manufacturers, do they have medical device experience or not? So I'm curious what your thoughts are on the overlap of quality management systems. What is covered under their quality management system? What's covered under your quality management system? How do the two interact? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's really key. And that's really the latest thing. And that's what Europe is really pushing on the MDRs, is more supplier quality management. So it's like today we're seeing a lot more companies asking these kind of questions. And this is what they should be doing, because there's no central database. Here's all the companies, because a lot of people play in different markets. Like Innovize, we're contract manufacturing and converting. We started getting into medical device only like 15 years ago. And we were the only converters at like the MDM shows. Now there's like 15 converters at the MDM shows. So more people are touching into it. So are you intermixing? I'm doing automotive, but I'm not going to do medical. Well, the automotive quality systems are different than the medical device quality system. I mean, there's a lot of overlap. I mean, at least you have a quality system. Right. So you have the controls, aerospace too, and those kind of things. But as a medical device manufacturer to a contract manufacturer, you really want to set up, if you have a partnership, you sort of do a survey just to understand the scope, and you may do an audit. Now, audits are, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but you really need to have a quality agreement with that contract manufacturer. So a supplier quality agreement. And what I've seen, the best practices, it's a quality agreement and it lists all the sections sort of the standard, like who's doing what. And you have a box that says, customer, supplier, and who's doing what.
Yeah.
So everybody can understand design controls. Okay, that's the customer. I'm not going to, as a contract manufacturer, I'm not going to approve the design output spec. You're going to do that. You're going to do the design verification. I'm going to do the process validation. You're going to do the complaint handling, and make sure you understand that. Now you're allowed to do complaints, and then the quality agreement, you put in that, they can audit us, and you're supposed to, change control, all the stuff that, don't change anything unless you tell us, and get a pre-approval. Those kind of things are all in there. Record retention time, those kind of things you want to have in your quality agreement.
I'm so glad you brought up the supplier quality agreement, because I think this is where a lot of contract manufacturer relationships break down, because, it was unclear on who is responsible for what. I mean, that should be a pretty thorough document that, to your point, I mean, it's breaking it down clause by clause, that it says, you do this, I do this, you do this. Sometimes there's that shared responsibility. But I think I hear a lot of companies that they're jumping the gun. They want to get into a relationship with the contract manufacturer without defining all of these things, because, they need to make 10 units or 100 units to support, animal study or clinical trial or what have you. Like, that's a mess. That's just a recipe for disaster.
Right. Yeah. Unless you can verify that what they made, you're looking at 100% inspecting it before you use it. I mean, it depends, but I mean, typically you're going to say, the contract, do this. I'm hiring you because you know how to make these things. You know how to make a catheter. So you make a catheter. This is the tubing I want, injection mold, this material around it. It's like, okay, what strength do you want? Well, what strength have you used in the past? Okay. I don't know how you're going to use this on a patient. Are you going to, put this up their nose? Or are you going to put it into their heart?
Right.
Totally different requirements on what the forces are, and how lubricious do you want this coatings to be. And it's like, if you ever bought a house, or you work with an architect, you want to design a house, with a builder. Okay, I want a house. That's like going to a builder and say, build me a 3-bedroom house. It's like, okay. I can tell you
Infinite
it's going to
options.
be $200 a square foot. And until you tell me what you want, I'm not going to be able to quote you a house. So the same thing, contract manufacturer, I'm not going to build this. I can tell you what the materials are going to cost. If you want, a 5-foot long single lumen PET catheter with this much, this, I can tell you what the raw materials are going to cost, but that's not the price we're going to charge you for the material because of the labor and tooling and everything else to set it up.
Right. I think the quality agreement, though, I think, we were going through some checklist items. It seems like, that should be baked into your supplier quality agreement, right?
Yeah, a lot of that stuff should be in your supplier quality agreement. And then, as Consiliso, I've done things where I've created a couple of templates. Here's a simple supplier quality agreement. It's like 3 pages, change control, audit, and that kind of thing. And then I have the more detailed one, which goes through every section of the standard. And I've also set up so you can have multi-part, parties. So you have a 3-way or something, or 4-way. It's like, you're doing this. Then you're going to give it to them. They're going to manufacture it. They're going to package it. They're going to sterilize it. And we're going to sell it. And it's like, who owns which part? And sometimes they're shared. It's like, both of us are going to do this. Well, then when you share it, then you have a note section saying, for this aspect, supplier A is going to do this, supplier B is going to do this. And then you have like a 3-way NDA or something so that y'all can talk, depending on who you're working with. Like if you're a totally virtual company, that's what you're going to need to do.
Yeah. Here's another thing I've heard and sadly still hear today. So startup company, obviously a lot of folks know Greenlight Guru. We have software that helps companies with their quality management system. And so sometimes we get in these conversations with folks and they're like, oh yeah, your product seems cool, but I don't need to do that. And like, but you're a medical device company. I'm like, no, my contract manufacturer is handling all that. I'm like, oh my goodness. So you saw my reaction to that. So I'm curious, what is your reaction when companies I'm going to outsource my quality?
You can't. I mean, it's like I said, if companies outsource their design, outsource their manufacturing, they really don't have it themselves. But you still have to have a quality system. And then your quality system has to have really good supplier controls because you're outsourcing everything. So they're expecting, the regulators are expecting you to then be watching your contract manufacturers and auditing them, because you've outsourced this key aspect. And there's what I was talking about later here is as you pick your suppliers for contract manufacturers, what level of criticality? And so this is a whole concept on risk-based quality systems. What risk is it? I typically say you have 4 different levels of risks for a supplier. 0, no risk, office supplies and that kind of stuff. So 3, what you do is going to directly affect the patient experience. If you mess up, they might die because of what you're doing. Okay, there's level 3. Then there's intermediate levels, the raw material suppliers and stuff like that. So these contract manufacturers are your highest level. And so with your highest level ones, you can scale on what kind of information control you want. On a level like 1 or 0, I don't really care if they have a quality system or not, because it doesn't matter. But level 1 and 2 and 3, they all have to have quality systems. Keep your ISO cert, great. But level 3, I'm going to audit you every year or every other year. There's a way of doing it. Now, the latest thing in the industry is there's some contract manufacturers, they have dedicated audit people because everybody comes in and audits them all the time. So the industry came up with MedRed. We've talked about that on your podcast in the past, but MedRed is this outsourced organization, similar to what automotive and aerospace did, or like military, the old DCAS. They're actually the manufacturers pay for them and the suppliers pay for them. And this person sits at the contract manufacturer's house, and they then do deep dive audits when your product is ready. So you're basically having control right there. So a lot of houses like sterilizers and forgers that just make metal parts for medical device industry, they have dedicated people that sit there, and then MedRed is a process for doing these audits then for contract manufacturers. So that's a whole program, and it's really more the bigger ones that do a lot of it. And that's something saying if you're a MedRed approved in that thing, MedRed approved supplier, there are controls in place that the big guys have really put in place. So it really would help you that, if I say you're a MedRed approved supplier, it's like, I probably don't need to audit you as much. I might still want to audit you once in a while, but you have the controls in place because if you get done every day.
Interesting.
So that's even a manufacturer that might manufacture auto parts, but they have this division for MedRed, or
if you're a MedRed supplier, all you're doing is medical. Gotcha. And there's basically somebody in the plant that's MedRed, that's the manufacturer's representative for the manufacturers that basically, the Medtronics, the Boston Size, Abbott's and stuff like that. They pay for this, and they have somebody sitting at those subcontract manufacturers. So that's sort of new. That's basically, I think 5 years ago, there wasn't any. Then I looked on their database, and there's about 40 or 50 manufacturers around the world that are MedRed certified that have different things that they're certified for. They're not certified for everything. They might do more, but they're certified for labeling, or they're certified for plastic injection molding, or they're certified for. Now, FDA is sort of not directly linked with that. That doesn't matter, but it's really part of your supplier controls. And for Europe, I think that will be, you put that into your process, into your supplier control process. You still probably need supplier quality agreements with them, so you understand the scope of stuff.
Well, something John said made me curious. So this is still under the umbrella of the supplier quality agreement, kind of. But he said, I like to be within strangling distance. Curious about if you have any stories about, times you wanted to strangle. What was it? The certain items that could make you want to strangle each other?
Oh, when I was at the external defibrillator company, we're based in Minnesota. We're having circuit boards made in South Dakota. Okay, that's trying to go cheaper because labor was cheaper out because they were more out in the country and stuff. We switched to a Malaysian supplier that's designed a huge box. It's like, okay, great. I got to go visit them. Okay. 20 hours later on a flight, you're there. You have to stay for a week. How do you do conference calls? They're 12 hours difference time zone. You want to talk to them. When are you going to have your calls? So assume you're going to have your calls 7 to 10 o'clock at night because that's their morning. And so when you got a conference with there, your nights are gone. If you need to talk with them, that's when you're going to have it because that's when they're in the plant. I mean, they might run 3 shifts, but when are there engineers there that you want to, or project managers and stuff you want to deal with? And once you get it fixed and get them going, it works great if you change nothing.
But there will be changes.
Right.
There will be changes.
I'm making introducers for, design hasn't changed in 30 years. Fine. Outsource that. It's not going to change. It hasn't changed in 30 years. Not going to change again. Your new company, I would not go there. Innovize, we're a contract manufacturer. We've had some people that have taken products that have been outsourced to China and Mexico and moved them back to the US to us because we automate the product. They were doing it manually. So we can provide better quality because it's more consistent because we've automated the processes. So you're outsourcing it. It's cheaper, but they're doing it manually. So there's more variability in the product and overall the quality is not as good.
Yeah. You said something a moment ago that I want to dive into a little bit. And it's really about scaling. I mean, early on as a company, my volume may be, let's just say in the tens or in the hundreds. Sure, I got a vision for down the road where I'll be selling tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of units. But I guess my word of caution is, generally speaking, is if I have a contract manufacturer that says they can do the hundreds versus the hundreds of thousands, they can do all of it, that raises a flag for me that says, because the scale is different. What I have to have from a manufacturing process is dramatically different. What are your thoughts about that?
You have to be able to go and have them show you what they're going to do differently. Now, there's some contract manufacturers. I want to be able to go on your manufacturing floor and see what you're doing. Some won't let you. You're not allowed to go back and see what's behind the curtain. You can talk to us in the conference room, but you can't. Some manufacturers will say, come on in and we'll help you out and show you. And that's the kind of thing, Innovize does is like, come on, I will show you the floor. It's like we scale because, to make small volumes, we're going to have to do it this way because I won't waste material. And then high volumes, going to do it this way. And then it's like, might have to qualify it differently, but we tell them that. So that's the kind of thing you're looking for is how are you going to do this? And ask them the questions. You have to know what they're doing. It's like, you can't be outsourcing. It's like, well, you do it and not, you still have to own. You're the owner. You own it. You're telling the FDA that you're the owner of the design. You have to own it. And you have, if you're auditing, you're about there and saying, how are you doing this? And look at their documentation and see what kind of records they're keeping. And you never know unless you have a history with them and you know that they have good records. That's good. I mean, but if you're, brand new to this, like, well, what does this mean? And if you do an audit of a supplier and they're teaching you stuff, that's one you want probably to use because they're going to help you. It's like, why am I doing this? It's because of this, this, and this. It's like, versus it's like, we have to do this. Why? Oh, that's what our process says. No. The standard says, and this is how we do it. If they help teach you about manufacturing and stuff, that's a good contract manufacturer because it's like, then you can make decisions based off of, if you've changed things in your design, this is what they're applying it to. And then you can ask them questions. A good contract manufacturer will answer those questions for you.
And you talked about like the rating scale or the criticality of suppliers, contract manufacturer, however you define it within your system is definitely the closer they are to the product that's going to be used in the patient, the more critical they are. That's sort of my, I guess, rule of thumb. But there has to be a partnership, and this is a strategic relationship that you have with them. And there needs to be enough transparency. I mean, you don't have to tell them all of your secrets, and certainly they may not tell you all of theirs, but there has to be good communication. There has to be good information exchange. And when it comes to scale, I've seen a lot of startups make a mistake. They choose a supplier or a contract manufacturer, and they communicate, we're going to be making hundreds of thousands of units. They're not going to do it right out the gate, and they don't choose a contract manufacturer that can scale and grow with them. They choose the contract manufacturer that's like full automation, that's, spitting product out, but they're not going to be ready for that. And that's going to be a rough relationship.
Yeah. Expectations of what set them, what are your POs going to be? What's your timing? Manufacturers come in. It's like, well, why don't you do all our manufacturing for us? It's like, okay, you have to put the money in. It's like, you want a clean room like this? We don't have one. If you want us to do it, that we can, we'll build this and we'll charge you for it, because you have to have some skin in the game. And that's part of the agreement too. It's like, you want to do something that's unique that we don't do yet, or we want to set it so it's flexible. We can do that, so it's going to cost. It's like, and contract manufacturers have to make the money. Contract manufacturers' margins, a medical device manufacturer, there's a lot of risk, but then there's a lot of reward, but then a lot of them fail. Contract manufacturers, we just take a little cut. We're not making huge profits here. We're here to be flexible and, keep the work going, but we're not going to make when I was at some of the medical device manufacturers, the margins they made on good products are like amazing compared to what manufacturers would make, contract manufacturers would make. So.
Etienne, I can talk all day about contract manufacturing. I don't want to hog the questions for Mark, so jump in, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, you covered several of the things that I was curious about. A little bit more maybe about process validation and the presence of the manufacturer versus the contract manufacturer in that process. How involved should they be?
Right. I mean, if you're doing work in the good manufacturer, what you should probably do is, first step, you've selected a manufacturer and you think they're best based on location and expertise and stuff like that. And you've set up a supplier quality agreement. So you set that expectation. So the first thing you should probably set up is a master validation plan. So this is what the expectation of how we're going to validate this product. And part of it is, here's the manufacturing process flow. You're going to need it for your regulatory submission. So you might as well get it put in a document right away. Here's the manufacturing process flow. Now, depending on the criticality of what's going in the manufacturing process flow, you're going to need a PFMEA or a risk assessment on the process. Yeah. And so the best typical way is a process failure modes effects analysis. And it's sort of a bottoms up approach. Now, there's other ways of doing it. You can do a top down approach too, but you're really trying to determine the risk of the contract manufacturer making a product that's going to meet spec. So you can build an FMEA right into your risk management document. You do standalone separate, depending on how complex the product is. And then in there, where you get your process flow, it's like, can the outputs of these processes be verified by the next step? And no, yes, no. So then that process flow, you say, that one needs to be validated, that one needs to be validated, that one needs to be validated, these steps. And then you lay it all out in one document. Now, if you're sterilized, put your sterilization in there. So this is something that you use as a way of controlling everything. And then this is the plan, and you release it, and then you send copies to your contract manufacturer. You might revise this plan a few times through it, but then as reports, this validation's done. Oh, it failed, but I got to change this. When you do that, then you modify the plan, but then you release reports that say, this is what the output is, and this is the report number from this, get the reports defined. So then when your validation's done and the master validation report's done, all the information for your regulatory submissions already defined. What happens is a lot of companies didn't do that. And I mean, right now I'm doing a ton of companies are doing remediation for the EU MDRs because, class 3s, we're always doing this, but class 1 and 2s weren't. So it's like, oh, we need to do this. We need to validate. Well, we never validated it because we asked you to, and you said no, you weren't going to pay for it. So I'm just going to do, it meets spec, but I'm not doing CPK analysis on all these things all the time. So the big guys, they come in with the master validation plan. Here, this is what I want you to do. But the small guys don't. And so if you're going in, talk to them about creating a master validation plan. And if they can only do part of it, that's fine. But then it's your document. And you talk to your other contract manufacturers and add to it. So you have one document to find where everything for that product is going to be.
I'm glad you mentioned PFMEA caveat. Some folks have labeled me as the anti-FMEA guy, and there's an asterisk to that. I think too many people have used FMEA as the only tool that they're using from a risk management perspective during the design process. And there's a point in time where FMEA during design is helpful, but it is invaluable for manufacturing processes. It is a wonderful, wonderful tool. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's another one of those things that raises the flag or my spidey senses. When you ask a contract manufacturer about how they're assessing risk of the manufacturing process, and they're like, what do you mean? It's like, whoa.
We're actually doing something interesting here. We're trying something new. It was almost manufacturer didn't ask it, but if we had an issue, we know we have like higher, scrap on a certain product. Yeah. We'll actually, when it's running, quality engineer will sit there with the press operator and walk through and say, okay, what can happen wrong here?
Nice.
What can happen wrong here? And you're talking, it's just the engineer with the person, the operator running it. Cool. Versus these engineers sitting in a room guessing what's happening.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, these are the things that happen. Okay, what do you think? This is high, medium, or low. Red, green, yellow for this is like that. Okay, that's a risk assessment. It doesn't have to be this RPN numbers and all this other stuff. It's like, what can you do? And then can I fix that from ever happening again? Yeah, if we just move this over here and did this over here, then Yeah, that's
Right.
what they want. It's you try to mitigate
Exactly.
risk. That's
They
all
don't
it
want
is.
engineers barricading themselves in a conference room for 8 hours for 3 days straight to come up with some magic,
Right.
whatever.
Well, that's a risk. Like, yeah, will whatever happen? No. What will happen? Well, they can mix the rolls up. It's like, well, how about we label the rolls differently so they
Right.
can't mix them up? It's like,
Yeah.
oh, what can really happen? And you ask people making the product.
You're absolutely right. I can remember being on a manufacturing line where we had a failure. Everybody was gathered around the failure. And me and another guy just started walking upstream. And I said, hey, what if it failed like at this operation? When would we detect it? He's like, well, not until there. I'm like, okay, so we can go all the way up to here. The potential failure could be 6 machines upstream. So you've got to start looking up there. That's really interesting. John beat me to it when he was talking about the PFMEA. So when we're building out this PFMEA document, are you suggesting it would be kind of the manufacturer is going to own this document, but working in conjunction or in partnership with the contract manufacturer to develop that?
Right. Yeah, because some of it is like, well, what's going to fail? This is going to fail. It's like, do you care about that? I mean, like, oh, that radius on this corner, I can't hold 3 thou on that radius. It's like, I don't care what the radius is, as long as it doesn't.
Maybe your
cut the
spec's too
patient.
tight. Loosen your spec up.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Like, change your spec. And that's the kind of thing in PFMEA is like the spec needs to change. And during the validation, oh, this fails. Like, well, do you need that or not? How's that going to affect the patient? If it does, great. If it doesn't, is this tubing going to come out? Well, what's going to happen? Here, I can't pull it. It's like, okay, that is strong enough. Okay, now measure that and tell me what it is. And I can tell you, and that's the spec going to be because that's strong enough because nobody's going to be able to pull that off or something,
Well,
So,
I mean, you just said something, about the patient, and I'm glad you brought that up too, because I think sometimes the OEM is not sharing information about the use of the product with the CM. And it's like, you got to share that information because you don't need to expect your contract manufacturer to become an expert in how the product is going to be used, but they need to have enough knowledge so that they know if X, Y, and Z happens, that wow, that's a critical component. That's the patient contacting, or it's used for this type of procedure.
Right.
I think that's really important.
Yeah. And then if it's patient contacting too, it's like, what's the biocompatibility? So anything you use to clean this machine, if it's going to contaminate the product, I need to know about it. And that was a huge recall. I remember this was a reprocessor. There, some company was reprocessing these dialysis filters and the company changed the solution. It's like, that they were cleaning with and ended up, killing some patients because they changed something and they thought, well, it cleans it better. It's like, yeah, but it's not compatible. So, and the contract manufacturer didn't know how it was used. So you really need to communicate, how it's used and what it's used for and understand, scopes and process controls.
That's really great. And as John mentioned, I know he can go on for hours and I could probably ask you more questions for myself. I want to be, respectful of your time and our listeners' time. Maybe we can have you back. I don't want to be too presumptuous here, but what do you think, John? We close?
Well, I mean, I think we've talked a lot about, I would say, generalities when it comes to contract manufacture today. So Mark, let's put our thinking caps on. And the next time we talk about contract manufacturing, maybe we can be a little bit more pointed and a little bit more specific. But yeah, if you're willing, love to have you back and talk about this topic down the road sometime soon.
Sure, that'd be great. Yeah. Details of sections and naming and numbering and configurations that you want to do and categorizations.
Yeah, there's all kinds of fun we're going to have here. So let's go ahead and shut this one down today. Mark Rutkiewicz with Innovize and Consiliso, thank you for sharing your wisdom on contract manufacturing. And Etienne Nichols, the co-host of the Global Medical Device Podcast, joining me. So that's been exciting. Folks, again, I want to remind you, of course, Greenlight Guru, we have a medical device success platform that's designed for you, the medical device professional, by actual medical device professionals like Etienne and myself. So if you're struggling or need some assistance with streamlining your processes around design and development, document and record management, post-market quality events, well, go check it out, www.greenlight.guru. You can learn a lot more about all the workflows that are in the Greenlight Guru software platform. And we'd love to chat with you and understand your needs and requirements and see if we have products and solutions that might help you. So again, check that out, www.greenlight.guru. As always, appreciate you, the listener of the Global Medical Device Podcast. Listeners are what continue to make the Global Medical Device Podcast the number one podcast in the medical device industry. So thank you for that. Continue to spread the word. And until next time, this is your host and founder at Greenlight Guru, John Speer, and you have been listening to the Global Medical Device Podcast.